Hello, Symposiast. I'm Dr. Angela Puka, Religious Studies PhD and University Lecturer, and this is your online resource for the academic study of magic, esotericism, paganism, shamanism, and all things occult, including necromancy. Yes, this is the topic that we're going to cover today, necromancy. Quite interesting, I would say. The word necromancy is derived from the Greek nekros, which means dead, and manteia, which means divination, and refers to a set of practices aimed at communicating with the dead for purposes ranging from divination and acquiring esoteric knowledge to seeking guidance, protection, or resolving disputes. Traditionally understood as a form of spirit summoning, necromancy has been applied across a broad spectrum of religious, cultural, and esoteric frameworks, encompassing ancestral veneration, ritual manipulation of spirits, and the invocation of the deceased for practical or spiritual ends. This practice often operates in liminal spaces, both physically and symbolically, and serves as a mediator between the living and the dead, the material and the spiritual, and the sacred and the profane. Its meanings and moral standings have evolved, shaped by theological, philosophical, and cultural contexts that reflect humanity's enduring engagement with death and the afterlife. So buckle up, because in this episode we cover what necromancy is in theory and also in practice, and how it has evolved throughout history and across different cultures. But before we dive into today's discussion, I'd like to highlight something vital. Your support makes it possible for me to provide free, academically grounded education in esotericism to everyone. So if you want to join this endeavor, you're not only empowering accessible peer-reviewed scholarship, but also ensuring the growth of a community passionate about informed esoteric studies. So consider joining our vibrant, ever-expanding Patreon community, where you will find exclusive content and discussions that deepen our exploration together. If Patreon isn't for you, supporting through PayPal, Coffee, or YouTube memberships is equally impactful. Or super thanking me in the comments. You also find all my services and my courses at drangelapuka.com, my personal website, as well as checking out the links in my bio, cards, info box, pinned comment, everywhere. To stay up to date with my latest insights and bypass the unpredictability of social media algorithms, sign up for my newsletter. This way, you will be the first to know about new content and projects. A heartfelt thank you to all who make this project possible. Your contribution truly brings academic esotericism to life. Now, let the symposium begin. A little note before we start. First of all, given that this is quite a broad overview of necromancy from history and in different traditions, is going to be oversimplified, because otherwise it would be impossible to cover so many things. I think that any type of overview or general introduction will be oversimplifying elements of the specific traditions. As always, I leave you the references on the screen and also in the description box. So if you want to dive deeper into any specific topic, please do so. In fact, I encourage you to do that. Also, let me know in the comments if there is any specific tradition or element that I'm going to cover that you would like me to make a specific video on, because I'm very open to suggestions. The second premise is that there are things that are going to be repeated, because I'm analyzing things from different lenses. But as the Romans used to say, repetita juvant, which in Latin means it helps to repeat things, which they implied to memorize them. So hopefully that helps. As I was mentioning, necromancy originates from the Greek nekros, dead, and manteia, divination, indicating its foundational purpose as a method of divination through the dead. Historically, practitioners sought insight into the future, hidden truths, or resolutions to complex problems by consulting the spirits of the deceased. However, the scope of necromancy extended beyond divination to encompass various ritual practices. While the use of necromancy for practical outcomes, such as protection, vengeance, or influencing decisions, may be inferred from historical accounts, these functions were neither universal nor consistently documented across cultures. As Daniel Ogden observes in Greek and Roman necromancy, necromancy often straddled the boundaries of religious reverence and magical pragmatism. This liminal position positioned necromancers as intermediaries between the living and the dead, and symbolically between the material and spiritual world. In classical antiquity, necromancy frequently manifested as psychagogia, which literally means soul leading, the summoning and communication with the spirits of the deceased. Unlike other divinatory practices, which might rely on interpreting celestial movements or natural omens, necromancy often required tangible interaction with the remains of the dead or their resting places. Rituals were conducted in locations imbued with liminal significance, such as gravesites, dedicated necromantic sanctuaries, or transitional spaces like crossroads, which were believed to facilitate access to the underworld. One of the most vivid accounts of necromancy appears in Lucan's Pharsalia, where the Thessalian witch Ericto performs a grisly rite. Her practices, including the use of fresh corpses, blood offerings, and invocations to chthonic deities, illustrate the corporeal focus of necromancy. These rituals relied on the belief that the soul remained connected to the body after death, necessitating physical proximity and material offerings to summon and compel spirits. This emphasis on corporeality distinguishes necromancy from practices such as mediumship, which often centered on more intangible modes of spirit communication, such as trances and visions. In addition to interacting with anonymous or recently deceased spirits, necromancy occasionally intersected with ancestor veneration, though these practices should not be conflated. For example, in ancient Mesopotamia, the Kispum ritual was central to maintaining familial and communal harmony with the spirits of ancestors. These ceremonies involved offerings of food and drink to ensure the favor and protection of ancestral spirits. As Jean Bottéro explains, however, Kispum focused on maintaining relational continuity rather than summoning or manipulating spirits, as in necromantic practices. Similar intersections between ancestor reverence and necromancy are evident in African and Afro-Caribbean traditions. For example, Haitian voodoo venerates the Gede spirits, Loa associated with death and the afterlife, who may be invoked for guidance, protection, and healing. However, voodoo's ancestral practices represent a holistic spiritual framework distinct from necromantic rites in Western esotericism, which often centered on summoning spirits for specific purposes rather than sustaining familial relationships. Necromancy in antiquity also incorporated animal sacrifice, often as part of rituals aimed at summoning spirits or invoking chthonic deities. Instructions in the Greek magical papyri prescribe the use of black animals, whose symbolic association with the underworld and liminality made them ideal offerings. While parallels can be drawn to similar uses of black animals in certain Indo-European traditions, these practices were not uniform across cultures. The symbolic use of these animals underscores necromancy's reliance on crossing boundaries between life and death, the mortal and divine, and the sacred and profane. Necromancy has occupied an ambiguous moral position across cultures and historical periods. In ancient Greece, it was closely associated with chthonic deities like Hades and Persephone. Sanctuaries such as the Necromanteion of Archeron served as formalized sites for necromantic rites, reinforcing the sacred dimension of these practices while simultaneously emphasizing their liminality. Necromancers were often portrayed as transgressive figures, operating outside societal norms while fulfilling vital roles as intermediaries with the dead. This dual perception continued into the medieval period, where necromancers, often literate clerics or scholars, combined classical traditions with ritual manuals and grimoires. Their practices, although grounded in learned traditions, became entangled with accusations of heresy and witchcraft as Christian demonology developed. As Richard Kiekefer discusses in Forbidden Rites, the association of necromancy with demonic pacts and subserving magic reinforced its moral ambiguity, casting necromancers as both erudite and deviant figures. Necromancy as a practice defies simplistic categorization. Its historical manifestations ranged from divination and ritual magic to ancestor veneration and spiritual mediation. While necromancers were often viewed with suspicion, their practices reflected broader cultural and religious attitudes towards death, the afterlife, and the permeability of spiritual boundaries. Far from being a relic of superstition, necromancy represents a complex and culturally embedded response to the mysteries of mortality and the human desire to bridge the divide between the living and the dead. The evolution of necromancy reflects its adaptability within diverse cultural, religious, and social frameworks. While initially integrated into certain sacred rites and communal practices, necromancy became marginalized and controversial with the rise of monotheistic religions, persisting in modified forms through clandestine channels. The earliest documented practices involving communication with the dead originate from Mesopotamian civilization. In this context, interactions with the deceased were deeply interwoven with religious and social obligations, primarily through ancestor veneration rather than necromancy as later defined. Rituals such as the kispum involved offerings of food and drink to ancestral spirits to ensure familial and communal harmony. These practices aimed at sustaining relationships with ancestors rather than summoning spirits for divination or manipulation. While ancestor veneration was central, explicit necromantic practices are less evident in Mesopotamian texts. Some incantations and rituals suggest attempts to protect against or appease restless spirits, etimu, reflecting a belief in the influence of the dead upon the living. However, these practices differ from necromancy as understood in later Western traditions. The Epic of Gilgamesh explores themes of mortality and the afterlife, but it does not depict necromantic rites wherein the dead are summoned for guidance or knowledge. In classical antiquity, necromancy developed as a distinct practice often associated with psychagogia, the summoning of souls to reveal hidden truths. Homer's Odyssey provides a foundational account where Odysseus conducts a ritual to consult the prophet Tiresias in the underworld. The ceremony involves a pit filled with blood offerings, emphasizing the corporeal and material aspects of Greek necromantic rites. Blood was believed to empower spirits, enabling communication with the living. Greek necromancy was closely linked to chthonic deities like Hades, Persephone, and Hecate. Sacred sites such as the Necromanteion of Acheron served as oracular centers where individuals sought contact with the dead, including both familial ancestors and other spirits. The diversity of Greek necromancy encompassed a range of practices and purposes, from personal guidance to communal prophecy. In Roman literature, necromancy is often portrayed with dramatic flair and moral ambiguity. Lucan's Pharsalia vividly describes the witch Ericto performing gruesome rituals to summon a dead soldier's spirit. While this account highlights the fear and fascination surrounding necromancy, it is a literary exaggeration intended to underscore the transgressive nature of such practices rather than a factual depiction of common rites. Roman attitudes toward necromancy were complex, viewing it as a source of esoteric knowledge but also associating it with impiety and social deviance. With the rise of Christianity, necromancy was increasingly scrutinized and condemned through a theological lens. Christian doctrine, articulated by theologians like Augustine of Hippo, categorized necromancy as heretical and deceptive. In The City of God, Augustine argues that what necromancers perceive as the spirits of the dead are in fact demons exploiting human vulnerability. This perspective reframed necromancy as a spiritual danger, aligning with Christian concerns about the afterlife and the soul's journey. Despite official prohibitions, elements of necromantic practice persisted, sometimes blending with Christian and residual pagan traditions. Texts like the Testament of Solomon include interactions with spirits and demons, but these are framed within contexts of exorcism and divine authority rather than necromantic summoning. The focus is on controlling or banishing malevolent entities, which reflects early Christian efforts to redefine and appropriate earlier ritual practices. Apocryphal writings and magical texts from this period illustrate the ongoing tension between traditional practices and emerging Christian orthodoxy. The reinterpretation of the dead as either saints or demonic figures contributed to debates about acceptable spiritual interactions, ultimately pushing necromancy further into the realm of the forbidden. In medieval Europe, necromancy experienced a transformation within the context of learned or ceremonial magic. Practiced by some clerics and scholars who had access to Latin text and classical knowledge, this form of magic, sometimes termed negromancy, a conflation of necromancy and black magic, integrated elements of ritual magic with Christian symbolism. Richard Kiekefer distinguishes this clerical necromancy from folk practices, noting its reliance on formalized rituals and esoteric texts. Key sources for medieval ritual magic include the Munich Manual of Demonic Magic, which provides instructions for summoning and commanding spirits, often blending Christian prayers with occult practices. These rituals frequently invoked the Holy Trinity and saints alongside attempts to control spirits, which reflects an intricate tension between adherence to Christian doctrine and engagement with prohibited arts. Practitioners aimed to achieve practical outcomes such as discovering hidden knowledge, securing love, or influencing others, situating necromancy as both an intellectual endeavor and a means of personal advancement. It's important to note that while texts like the Picatrix were influential during this period, they primarily focused on astrological and talismanic magic rather than necromancy specifically. The Picatrix is a comprehensive treatise on celestial magic, and although it touches on various esoteric topics, it does not serve as a primary source for necromantic practices. In the early modern period, necromancy became increasingly associated with witchcraft in popular imagination, contributing to its criminalization during witch hunts. However, the primary targets of these hunts were often women and marginalized individuals accused of maleficium, or harmful magic, rather than scholarly practitioners of necromancy. The association with demonic pacts and heresy reflected the influence of Christian demonology on societal perceptions of all forms of magic. Despite the risks, some intellectual figures continued to explore practices involving communication with spiritual entities. John Dee, a prominent mathematician, astronomer, and advisor to Queen Elizabeth I, engaged in what he termed angelic communication. Assisted by mediums like Edward Kelly, Dee sought to converse with angels to gain esoteric wisdom and advance human knowledge. His works, including Heptarchia Mystica and Liber Loageth, document these endeavors. While these practices involved contacting otherworldly beings, they were framed within a Christian cosmology and distinguished from necromancy, as he sought communication with divine messengers rather than the spirits of the dead. The early modern period thus reflects a complex landscape where necromancy, redefined and often misunderstood, persisted as a topic of fascination and fear. It intersected with burgeoning interest in science, exploration, and the occult, which shows the enduring human desire to transcend the boundaries of the known world. The perception and practice of necromancy have been profoundly influenced by the cultural, religious, and theological frameworks of various societies. As a practice focused on communication with the dead, necromancy has taken on symbolic, functional, and spiritual roles across different contexts. Historically, necromancy acted as a means of mediating between the living and the dead, deeply rooted in the spiritual and social systems of various cultures. While not all practices involving the dead align with the Western definitions of necromancy, similar themes emerge, including the desire for guidance, reconciliation, and spiritual influence. However, the specifics of these practices varied widely depending on their cultural and religious settings. In ancient Greece and Rome, necromancy was closely associated with chthonic deities such as Hades, Persephone, and Hecate. Spirits, or eidola, were believed to reside in the underworld and could be summoned through specific rites and offerings. These rites were not solely acts of reverence, they also served as tools for divination and influence, particularly for uncovering hidden truths. While most literature on Roman necromancy centers on private or magical uses, some historical accounts suggest its occasional application in military and political contexts. However, claims of Roman generals using necromancy, such as those in Tacitus, are better understood as anecdotal or symbolic rather than indicative of systemic statecraft practices. In African and Afro-Caribbean traditions, practices involving communication with the dead are more appropriately described as forms of ancestral veneration or spiritual consultation. Among the Yoruba, rituals for Egun, ancestral spirits, maintain familial continuity, resolve disputes, and offer guidance. These practices do not fit the Western concept of necromancy as the summoning or manipulation of spirits, but align with its broader principles of connecting with the dead for specific outcomes. Similarly, Haitian voodoo involves engaging with the Loa, such as Baron Samedi, and the Gede spirits, mediators between life and death. These rituals emphasize healing, protection, and reconciliation, framing the spirits as intermediaries rather than entities to be controlled. In East Asia, traditions involving the dead are not typically classified as necromancy, but share analogous features. In Chinese ancestral rites, summoning spirits to secure blessings or resolve familial conflicts highlights the ongoing presence of the dead in communal life. Practices like Jiuji or ghost manipulation occasionally involve interactions with spirits but are more focused on harmonious integration rather than coercion. Similarly, elements of Japanese esoteric Buddhism, Mikkyo, involve seeking guidance from deceased monks or revered figures. These practices are rooted in Buddhist cosmology and emphasize ethical and spiritual dimensions, aiming for enlightenment rather than dominion over spirits. The rise of monotheistic religions, particularly Judaism and Christianity, significantly transformed the perception of necromancy, recasting it from a respected or functional practice to one associated with heresy and moral transgression. This shift reflected broader theological debates concerning the nature of the soul, the afterlife, and divine authority. The Hebrew Bible explicitly condemns necromancy, categorizing it alongside sorcery and other prohibited forms of divination. In Deuteronomy 18:10 to 12, necromancy is presented as an affront to Yahweh's authority, while the story of the witch of Endor captures the ambivalence surrounding its practice. In this narrative, King Saul successfully summons the prophet Samuel through a necromancer. While the act is efficacious, it is simultaneously portrayed as a violation of divine law. Scholars such as Anne Jeffers suggest that this story illustrates the persistence of necromancy despite its theological unacceptability, which reflects tensions between official doctrine and popular practices. In early Christianity, theologians like Augustine of Hippo reframed necromancy within a demonological framework. Augustine argued in City of God that necromancers did not truly communicate with the souls of the dead, but were deceived by demons impersonating spirits. This interpretation became foundational for Christian demonology, casting necromancy as a spiritually perilous act of deception. Despite official condemnation, elements of necromantic practices persisted in syncretic forms. For example, the veneration of saints and relics often blurred boundaries between orthodox intersection and spiritual communication. Relics were believed to connect practitioners to the spiritual power of saints, occasionally paralleling necromantic rites. Later movements like Theosophy further redefined necromancy, interpreting it as interaction with residual energy or astral forms rather than genuine spirits of the deceased. This view reflects a modern spiritualist approach that underscores astral and metaphysical dimensions over traditional necromantic rites. The engagement with the dead in necromantic practices raises complex ethical questions, particularly concerning the agency and respect of the spirits involved. Many cultural traditions highlight reciprocity and honor in their interactions with the dead, contrasting sharply with depictions of necromancy as exploitative in Western demonology. Among the Sami people of Scandinavia, rituals involving communication with ancestral spirits focus on healing and communal reconciliation rather than manipulation. These practices highlight ethical responsibility, ensuring that spiritual engagement remains harmonious and beneficial. Similarly, many African traditions frame interactions with spirits within a moral framework of mutual respect, ensuring that ancestral spirits act as guardians rather than vengeful entities. In contemporary occultism, the appropriation of necromantic elements from non Western traditions has sparked debate about cultural commodification. Practices derived from voodoo or other African spiritual systems are sometimes used without understanding their cultural significance, raising ethical concerns. Scholars such as Laenek Hourbon stress the importance of contextualizing these practices within their historical and spiritual frameworks, cautioning against reducing them to superficial rituals detached from their original meaning. Now let's talk about necromantic practices. So, necromantic practices, though varied across cultures and historical periods, as you have seen, we have used here the term necromancy in quite a broad way. I should have made that as a premise, but obviously we always realize these things later. But yeah, I've clearly used the term necromancy in a quite broad way. And so, by using it in such a way, we can see how these practices are present in disparate way across cultures and historical periods. And they still share foundational elements in their ritual structure, in the symbolic tools and intended outcomes. These rituals include anything from ancestral veneration to complex ceremonies aimed at summoning or interacting with spirits. While necromancy and ancestral veneration often overlap in their engagement with the dead, they are distinct practices. Necromancy, as traditionally defined, focuses on the active summoning or manipulation of spirits, often to achieve specific outcomes like divination, guidance, or magical workings. In contrast, ancestral veneration typically revolves around honoring the deceased, maintaining familial or communal harmony, and seeking blessings without coercive elements. Some practices included here may align more closely with ancestral veneration, but are examined for their necromantic aspects, particularly where communication with or invocation of the dead occurs. Necromantic rituals are often constructed around symbolic and practical techniques that enable practitioners to mediate between the living and the dead. A key element is the preparation and purification of the practitioner, frequently emphasized in formalized ritual traditions. Texts like the Greek magical papyri describe specific preparations, including fasting, abstinence from meat and wine, and ritual cleansing. These practices are believed to heighten spiritual receptivity and create a protective barrier against malevolent forces. While such purification processes are prominent in structured magical systems, they are less common in folk traditions, where ritual immediacy often takes precedence over elaborate preparation. The location and timing of necromantic rituals are equally significant. Liminal spaces such as crossroads, cemeteries, or specially consecrated areas are frequently chosen for their symbolic role as thresholds between the living and the dead. Similarly, the timing of rituals often align with cultural beliefs about the thinning of the veil between realms. In Western traditions, specific dates such as Samhain or All Souls' Day are considered optimal for contacting the dead, while Greco-Roman practices may prioritize midnight or other times associated with heightened spiritual activity. These temporal considerations show us broader cultural frameworks rather than universal principles. Offerings and sacrifices form a crucial part of necromantic rituals, functioning as a means to attract, appease, and empower spirits. In ancient Greek necromancy, libations of milk, honey, and wine were poured into trenches to summon spirits, as described in Homer's Odyssey. Blood sacrifices, often seen in Greco Roman practices, were believed to provide energy to spirits, enabling temporary manifestation or communication. However, other traditions substitute these offerings with culturally significant items such as rum, cigars, or food, as seen in Haitian voodoo. emphasizing the symbolic resonance rather than the substance of offerings. Ritual tools play an essential role in many necromantic traditions, particularly those rooted in ceremonial magic. The Munich Manual of Demonic Magic, for instance, describes the use of candles made from human fat, believed to illuminate the astral realm and facilitate contact with spirits. Similarly, mirrors or reflective surfaces are frequently used to manifest spirits visually, a practice that has informed modern scrying techniques. Such tools, however, are less prominent in folk practices, where invocations and offerings often suffice for spirit communication. Historical and cultural case studies reveal the diversity of necromantic practices and their adaptation to specific contexts. The Greek magical papyri provides some of the earliest detailed instructions for necromantic rituals. One notable example involves summoning a spirit through offerings of wine, honey, and blood, with the goal of gaining secret knowledge or personal assistance. These texts highlight the structured nature of Greco-Roman necromantic practices, which rely on precise incantations and symbolic gestures. Rural Italian folk traditions provide a different perspective, highlighting communal and protective dimensions of necromantic practices. During All Souls' Night, rituals at gravesites involve lighting candles, offering food and drink, and reciting invocations passed through oral tradition. These practices aim to maintain harmony between the living and the dead, ensuring mutual well being rather than exerting control over spirits. While primarily ancestral in nature, the communicative and interactive elements of these rites suggest necromantic practices. In Haitian voodoo, necromantic elements are central to rituals involving the Gede spirits, who govern death and the afterlife. Practitioners invoke figures like Baron Samedi through songs, dances, and offerings, seeking their guidance on matters such as health, justice, and protection. Although these rituals focus on veneration, the communicative aspect and the spirit's intermediary roles align with necromantic principles. Nordic traditions also reveal elements of necromancy, particularly in Finnish rune chants. These practices involve summoning ancestral spirits through sacred verses and the use of herbs to induce a liminal state. While primarily focused on healing and divination, the interaction with spirits reflects key aspects of necromantic practice, albeit within a shamanic framework rather than a coercive one. Necromantic rituals historically served a variety of purposes, shaped by cultural beliefs and practitioner intent. One of the most common applications is divination, where practitioners seek hidden knowledge, resolve disputes, or gain insight into future events. Babylonian Kispum rites, for instance, involve consulting ancestral spirits for guidance on familial or legal matters. While these rites are more closely aligned with ancestor veneration, their communicative nature allows for inclusion in a broader necromantic framework. Healing and protection represent another dimension of necromantic practice. In Finnish tradition, rune chants invoke ancestral spirits to address spiritual imbalances or illness. Similarly, rituals in Haitian voodoo may call upon the Gede spirits for protection against harm, which demonstrates the practical and communal aspects of spirit interaction. Magical workings often involve compelling spirits to perform tasks such as revealing hidden treasures, enacting vengeance, or influencing external events. Finally, necromantic rituals can serve as a means of spiritual guidance, allowing practitioners to seek wisdom or moral insights from ancestors or revered figures. In Asian voodoo, for example, rituals involving the Gede spirits frequently address personal or communal challenges and offer a blend of practical and philosophical guidance. Now, necromancy has often been framed as a challenge to divine authority, particularly within monotheistic traditions that emphasize strict boundaries between the mortal and divine realms. The Hebrew Bible explicitly condemns necromancy in passages such as the one in Deuteronomy, which groups it with other forbidden practices like divination and sorcery. These prohibitions reflect a broader theological concern with maintaining exclusive reliance on Yahweh for guidance and rejecting practices associated with foreign or idolatrous influences. The narrative of the Witch of Endor in 1 Samuel 28 illustrates the tension surrounding necromancy in ancient Israelite culture. In this story, King Saul seeks the assistance of a necromancer to summon the spirit of the deceased prophet Samuel. Although the summoning is successful, the act is portrayed as an act of desperation and disobedience, as Saul had previously outlawed necromancy. While the spirit of Samuel delivers an accurate prophecy, foretelling Saul's defeat and death, the episode underscores the theological rejection of necromancy as a legitimate means of seeking divine insight. Scholars such as Anne Jeffers have noted the ambivalence in this account. Necromancy is depicted as effective, yet it is simultaneously condemned for transgressing the boundaries established by divine law. In Islamic theology, necromancy is similarly regarded with suspicion, largely due to its association with pre-Islamic pagan practices. The Quran prohibits divination and summoning of spirits, framing such acts as shirk, the sin of associating partners with God. While necromancy is not explicitly addressed, its functions align with broader prohibitions against attempting to gain supernatural knowledge through intermediaries. Certain Islamic esoteric traditions, particularly within Sufism, include practices that involve spiritual communication, such as invoking the presence of saints. However, these are framed within a theological context that emphasizes submission to divine will and the pursuit of spiritual purification. Importantly, these practices differ from necromancy as traditionally defined, as they do not involve summoning spirits for personal gain or manipulation. The acceptance or rejection of necromancy often reflects cultural attitudes toward death and the afterlife. In societies where the dead are seen as active participants in communal or spiritual life, practices involving communication with the deceased are more integrated into religious traditions. For example, in ancient Egyptian beliefs, the dead were considered intermediaries with the divine. Funerary rituals, such as the opening of the mouth, were designed to restore the deceased agency in the afterlife, enabling them to act on behalf of the living. While these practices share similarities with necromancy in their engagement with the dead, they are more accurately categorized as ancestor veneration or funerary rites, as they focus on empowering the dead rather than summoning them for specific purposes. Conversely, in cultures with stricter separations between the realms of the living and the dead, necromancy has often been marginalized or stigmatized. In medieval Europe, necromancers were frequently depicted as liminal figures who operated on the fringes of orthodoxy. Often clerics or scholars, these individuals combined Christian liturgical elements with forbidden magical practices, drawing on texts like the Munich Manual of Demonic Magic. Their rituals, which included summoning spirits to reveal hidden knowledge or perform tasks, embodied both intellectual authority and spiritual deviance. Richard Kiekefer underscores that this blending of orthodoxy and transgression made necromancers a focal point for anxieties about heresy and the misuse of spiritual power. Some philosophical considerations now. Necromancy raises fundamental questions about the nature of spirit, consciousness, and memory. In esoteric traditions influenced by theosophy, spirits are often conceptualized not as fully autonomous beings, but as fragments of consciousness or astral forms lingering between the material and spiritual realms. Theosophical interpretations indeed describe spirits as residual shells or energy forms left behind after death, lacking true agency or consciousness. Such perspectives recast necromancy as a form of astral manipulation rather than genuine communication with sentient entities. This interpretation shifts the focus from the ethical implications of summoning the dead to questions about the nature of the spiritual residue that persists after death. Metaphorically, necromancy can also be understood as a symbolic dialogue with history and memory. Practices involving the summoning of the dead may represent an engagement with the past, whether through the preservation of ancestral legacies or the confrontation of unresolved cultural traumas. By invoking the spirits of the dead, practitioners symbolically reconnect with lost knowledge, explore questions of identity, and address the tensions between continuity and change. This interpretation positions necromancy as a mechanism for exploring collective memory and existential concerns, rather than solely as a literal summoning of spirits. To conclude, necromancy, with its complex and multifaceted history, defies simplistic categorization as a relic of superstition or heretical practice. Across cultures and eras, necromancy has functioned as a bridge between the living and the dead, fulfilling roles that range from divination and protection to ancestor veneration and philosophical exploration. Its adaptability to shifting religious, cultural, and theological frameworks has allowed it to persist despite periods of marginalization and prohibition, evolving into new forms within modern esoteric traditions. Beyond its ritual practices, necromancy provokes profound ethical and philosophical questions about humanity's relationship with mortality, memory, and the unknown. It challenges us to consider the boundaries between life and death, the nature of consciousness, and the way in which the past shapes our present. By studying necromancy, we uncover not only its historical significance, but also its enduring resonance as a reflection of humanity's quest to engage with the mysteries of existence and the afterlife. These are my references, which you will also find in the description box. This is it for today's video. If you watched until this point, leave me a skull emoji. Now, my dear symposias, this project of delivering free academic knowledge based on peer-reviewed scholarship can only exist thanks to your support. So if you have the means and want to offer this knowledge to everybody, please consider supporting my work with a one-off PayPal donation by joining my memberships, super thanking me in the comments, checking out my services at drangelapuca.com. And also you can join my Patreon, my fantastic community. You can see here all the list of all the perks that you will get at each different tier. And I really hope that you consider joining. Lots of you guys message me and send me DMs because you want me to elaborate more on one topic or another. Well, you can ask me during one of our meetings, which you can join at any tier, or you can have one-to-one conversations with me. So I hope that you consider joining. All links to support me are found in the description box, in bio, and pinned comment everywhere. So if you want to support me, you will find a way. And also, don't forget to smash the like button, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Please share my videos around. If you adore my work and you care about me, keep doing this. I would really, really appreciate you guys for sharing my videos around and allowing the symposium to grow. Leave me a comment to let me know what you thought about this video. And activate the notification bell. I don't think I've said it yet, because otherwise you will not be notified when I upload a new video. Also sign up for my newsletter, because that way you will never miss out anything that I've been up to, and you will get exclusive thoughts and pictures and fun stuff. So definitely sign up for my newsletter. It's free. And thank you so much for being here. I really hope that you stay tuned for all the academic fun. Bye for now. Today we hold